Good morning. My name is Isabel Hilton. I'm the CEO of China Dialogue, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this London Climate Action Week discussion on a relationship that's pretty critical for the success of global mitigation efforts, that of the European Union and the People's Republic of China. The EU has a Green Deal and a 2050 carbon neutrality target. China has eco-civilization, and since Xi Jinping's recent announcement in the UN General Assembly, a 2060 carbon neutrality target. They have a strong economic relationship. The EU is China's biggest trading partner, and China is now the EU's second biggest. But in recent times, there have also been notable tensions over trade, over investment, over access to markets, intellectual property, and over strategic and security concerns. The European Commission last year famously redefined the relationship with China as simultaneously a cooperation partner, a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. So where does climate fit in all that? 4 years of Donald Trump have put considerable pressure on the EU to keep a distance from China. Visits and interactions earlier this year were marked by very public tensions. And at the June summit, held by video, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, laid out 3 benchmarks for credible Chinese climate action. At a minimum, she said, China must live up to the commitments under the Paris Agreement, commit to climate neutrality, and give decarbonization a central role in the next 5-year plan. Well, we have 2 out of 3. The third is still in the balance. So we're at a most interesting moment. Japan, South Korea, and others have declared 2050 targets. The question is not the direction, but the speed and the credibility of all these plans. Are they backloaded? Will they be delivered? China's target and the US election results have opened up new perspectives for COP26. Before then, we will have China's 14th 5-year plan and the biodiversity COP15 in Kunming. It's encouraging. And you could say we need a little encouragement because, frankly, we still have a mountain to climb. So can the EU and China separately exercise leadership and together accelerate global mitigation efforts? Now, before we begin our discussion, China Dialogue is about to publish a report on the climate relationship between the EU and China, and a link to this report will be available to everyone who's registered for this webinar. Now, let me introduce this morning's wonderful panel. Jennifer Tollmann is from the leading climate think tank E3G, and Jennifer is a policy advisor in E3G's climate diplomacy and geopolitics team in Berlin. She works on European climate diplomacy. She regularly advises government and civil society on climate in the Sino-European and transatlantic relationships. Before that, she worked on integrated climate risk management at GIZ, looking particularly at small island developing states. Nis Grünberg, also in Berlin. Nis is a senior analyst at MERICS, the leading European think tank on China, and he's an expert on the Chinese energy sector and state-owned enterprise reform. His research focuses on party-state governance, elite politics, and China's sustainable development, and he's published widely on China's political reforms and the political economy of China's energy sector. Dr. Chen Ji is a principal at the Beijing office of the world-renowned Rocky Mountain Institute, and he also heads the Energy Transitions Commission China Secretariat, where he leads a program that aims to accelerate China's energy transition to zero carbon by 2050. He's been working in climate and energy for more than 15 years and previously worked in a Chinese central government agency. And Dong Yue of the Energy Foundation in China, where he is a research fellow on international climate affairs. He works on strategy and analysis related to international energy and climate, including international climate action, multilateral climate governance, and international stakeholder cooperation and dialogue. So we are really well served this morning. Now, we're keen to hear from all of you, so please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. But first of all, I want to understand how our panel sees the situation we're in now. And Dong Yue, perhaps I could begin with you. So we have Biden as president-elect. And despite anything Donald Trump might say to the contrary, the US will rejoin Paris. When the US announced its departure, the question of who would lead global efforts was very much alive. Was it the EU? Was it China? Now the US will be back in the game, but this is a more complicated triangle than it was 4 years ago, and for many reasons. As we approach COP26, which do you think of these enormous entities do you expect will show leadership? And what would leadership look like in this particular moment?
Thank you very much, Isabel. Well, thank you first for this wonderful introduction and for inviting me to this very timely webinar. I will try to address this very complex question in three parts. First, very quickly, we see that we have a renewed climate momentum in the world. And then I'll give you some details on our analysis on China's commitment and concrete climate actions. And also, lastly, the immediate opportunities for concrete actions that are open to us for positive economic benefits and resilient recovery. First, on the renewed momentum aspects. So as you mentioned, the COVID pandemic has disrupted international cooperation and multilateralism. But it also reminded us of the importance of resilience against global risks and the protection of climate, nature, and health in an integrated manner. And over the last 6 months, we have witnessed a renewed climate momentum. First with the EU, as you mentioned, then with China, and now with both of those countries, regions, but also the UK, Canada, Japan, and Korea. And soon we all hope for the President-elect Biden's commitment for a net zero target. More than 70% of the world GDP and 60% of the world's greenhouse gases will be covered by a net zero target. And so this is really a turning point for climate action. And as you said, you mentioned, the EU is in the process of updating its NDC to 55%. And in the US, the Biden administration campaign has promised to allocate $2 trillion for climate action. And so what about China? So as you all know, at the UN General Assembly on the September 22nd, China committed to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, to scale up its NDC and peak its carbon emissions before 2030. And recently, domestically, it's been less in the international news, but the Chinese government has taken a series of concrete actions that confirm its determination to address climate change in certain sectors. And so rather in different order, first the national ETS has been revived with a public consultation. And now we have a new timetable, which extends up to 2025, and where the Chinese ETS will include numerous sectors. Then in transport, new energy vehicles is up and going. And we have an industry development plan up to 2035, mandating public procurements for public service vehicles to be electric, and setting electric vehicle sales targets. Then we also had guidance, all of this just in the few recent weeks, on climate finance, which was published commonly by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, by the National Development and Reform Commission, the Public Bank of China, and Insurance and Security Regulation Commissions on what is climate finance. And something that might be overlooked is the fact that the Ministry of Environment and Ecology announced its intention to incorporate climate-related indicators into China's central inspection system on environment. This is quite critical. Although the exact timeline of this measure is still unknown, we expect this measure to really mainstream carbon emissions into local authorities and make the peaking of carbon emissions top-level political KPI for local leaders, probably at a level similar to their GDP targets for now. So this is really something that is important, and we feel that this could build an enforcement mechanisms for achieving the climate targets in China. So as we see, all these major countries have taken decisive steps towards climate action. We believe this creates a unique opportunity to a global green economic recovery. And we feel that this calls for immediate climate action in some sectors where climate is aligned with economic interests. And we feel that in China, those sectors, it could be energy transition first, and then the development of digital economy to improve the efficiency of manufacturing and tackling also the consumption side of emissions. And lastly, low carbon urbanization, where a lot of countries are facing the issue of rampant urbanization and the need for renovations and new kind of urban design and new urban transport. So we hope that these concrete actions will open opportunities for cooperation and mutually encourage a higher ambition and lower the cost of climate action over the world. I'm very looking forward to this discussion, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That was a great combination of high-level ambition and ground-level governance questions, which, of course, all of those have been issues in China previously. Jennifer, from what you've heard, does that add up to leadership in your view?
I think it adds up to the beginnings of leadership, in my view. I think one of the really interesting dynamics here that we're seeing are that because we now have a field of distributed leadership, as you said early on, we've seen a lot of countries more recently commit to net zero transition. And in fact, we're under President-elect Biden, we might see the entire G7 be committed to a net zero pathway as early as next year. So this now means that we can see different people taking different leadership in different sectors. And I think that's really the interesting question for next year. China and EU are no longer the only game in town, which is a really good thing. The question now becomes, what do they lead on and where are they credible on and what can they do together? Now, in that, I think there are three types of leadership that it's really worth highlighting. One is very much what Dong Yue was also talking about, the domestic leadership at home, walking the talk, putting in place the credible targets. And that's something that I do think the EU has really been leading on, both in terms of its Green Deal, but also in terms of immediately backing up any NDC that it does agree by the end of the year, any 2030 target that it does agree by the end of the year with money through its recovery packages and through its budget, which currently has a 37 to 40% climate earmarking target. The exact target will depend on what comes out of the legislative discussions on this, but that's the range in which they're talking about at the very least earmarking for climate, but also actually putting in place the legislation that makes it credible, which is what the Commission has termed the Fit for 55% package. Now, I personally think this sounds like a fitness plan for European Parliament members, but it is actually a really credible set of legislative packages. So that is the first type of leadership, domestic leadership. And I think what the European colleagues are really looking for from China is showing that domestic leadership to make it credible, to become a cooperation partner on the international stage on some of these pieces. They don't want to see international cooperation plastering over insufficient delivery at home. So that is the balance that will need to be struck. But then there are two other really important types of leadership that are going to be really critical for COP26 success next year. One is leadership in cooperation, and the other is leadership in managing competition. Now, the reality is that climate isn't just about targets anymore. Climate has become an economic reality for a ton of countries and will only become more so an economic reality. And that brings it into the realm of geopolitics and trade-offs. And so while there will always be opportunities for cooperation, there are also new areas of competition that will need to be managed. Now, on the cooperation front, some of the types of leadership that we could really see EU and China cooperating on are things like debt. Debt is going to be the biggest challenge of next year, particularly in determining whether developing countries can afford the luxury of a green recovery, or whether this is something that only the G7 can afford. And this is something where China, as the largest creditor in the world, is really key, and Europe is very key to engage on this. Other opportunities for cooperative leadership are on sustainable finance. What is considered good and sustainable investment internationally? Are there going to be international standards, and how aligned are the domestic standards that Europe, but also Japan and China are working on going to be? And finally, obviously, the big COPs. We have a lot of big summits coming up next year, and how do you organize the international calendar to get the most out of them? So both the CBD, the biodiversity COP in China, but also the climate COP in the UK that Europe has a really strong stake in, particularly as Italy is co-hosting. Now, on the competition front of leadership, we're going to be seeing a ton of these major economies putting a lot of their recovery money into green technologies and green innovation, if things go well. And that is amazing for the climate, but it does also raise questions around what a level playing field looks like, and managing those trade and those competition dynamics is going to be really key. Who is going to step up to show leadership on that? The European Union is already talking about a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but that can't come without dialogue with trade partners, including China, about what that looks like and what managed trade and level playing fields are. And finally, if we're actually going to see Europe, China, Japan, and the US really heavily investing in innovation, particularly around things like hydrogen, but also around things like digitalization, that's going to bring some competition as well. Who is going to be the technology maker? Who is going to be the technology taker? So there's a ton of leadership to go around, and EU and China will need to play big roles in doing this, but the field has really widened over the last couple of months. We would have been having a very different conversation 6 months ago.
Jennifer, thank you. And that's just a very exciting perspective. And I think we can all feel the momentum that has picked up over the last few months. But as you signal, this momentum itself can lead to complications with some unresolved issues. And Dr. Chen, I'd like to come to you on this question of leadership, competition, and cooperation, and you have modeled China's transition very effectively, and you have great experience in this. So what you're looking at now in China, there are a couple of questions that have come up in the contributions so far. Does the short-term action demonstrate the kind of leadership that a long-term target does? And in the relationship with Europe, this question of competition and cooperation, which I'm sure we'll come back to later in the discussion, but if you could maybe touch on that, that would be very helpful in the context of who's leading and how leadership is exercised.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I think this is a rather very interesting topic, because I remember that only a few years ago, when Trump administration announced to withdraw from Paris Agreement, everyone in the community was concerned about who is going to lead us, to fight against the climate change. But I think the challenge, well, it's not a challenge, but the problem that we are facing is what kind of consortium of leadership that we are going to, forge today. Which, as you rightly pointed out, as China announced its carbon neutrality target, EU just adopted a Green Deal, and Biden becoming the president elected. So the general public may have the perception that the climate issue all of a sudden moves back among the top priorities of major economies. In fact, the climate actions have never stopped in those three countries or region. Even in the US, we see great progress that has been made at the state levels and from a business community. So I think a more important question for global climate is how these three powers should work together and lead the world move towards zero carbon or carbon neutrality future. Since we are talking about EU and China today, I will specifically focus on this topic in this bilateral context. I personally see the China and EU climate collaboration at three levels. Number one, international relation level. This is pretty much about why this is ideal timing for EU and China climate collaboration. And number two, the policy level. This is about how these two regions learn from each other. And number three, the technology and the business level. This is about how these two regions find appropriate way to collaborate in the context of competition at the emerging global value chain and cultivated by carbon neutrality future. So at the international relation level, with increasing voice for deglobalization due to the pandemic and the trade conflicts among major economies, China actually has a pressing desire to secure Europe as an essential partner in globalization. While there are many agenda items for EU and China to discuss, some of which are more difficult than others. carbon neutrality is one of the few topics that the two regions have the most commonality. So China therefore has more diplomatic incentive to collaborate with EU on leading the global efforts for addressing climate change. So this is also the case for China and US relation, I assume. So at the policy level, I think Dongyue and Jennifer talk a lot about this area. We've already seen many common areas that the two regions plan to make efforts to achieve either Green Deal or ecological civilization. So including, like, for example, supercharging stakeholders at a sub-national level, right? As Dongyue just mentioned, that in the draft of 14th five-year plan, it talks about the localities picking actions. And also we see the European cities or states or provinces have many best practices in low carbon building, EV system and public transport system and green urbanization. And also using the carbon markets to pricing the carbon emission. I think I don't need to elaborate, and I think Dongyue also mentioned it a lot in his intervention early on, and also the climate finance. So what I want to, in the last, particularly mention is at the technical and technology and the business level. An essential reason why both China and the EU are incentivized to move towards carbon neutrality is the attraction of national competitive advantage in future green economy. A heated area is green hydrogen. Once the hydrogen economy comes into shape, it will provide millions of new and clean jobs from, for example, electrolyzers, manufacturers, to transportation and a pipeline operation for the transporting green hydrogen and hydrogen supply to heavy industry consumers. But some voice from, particularly from the European sides, worry that this kind of industry, emerging industry, will repeat the story of solar PV, in which European companies were overtaken by Chinese counterparts and lose the market share in the past 10 to 15 years. But my opinion is that we should let the market use invisible hands to allocate resource at a global level. And what EU and the China governments need to do is to, first of all, jointly create the market and help accelerate the expansion of the market through collaboration on technology innovation and the market opening, which will overall benefit the global climate. Secondly, the governments on both sides need to jointly set up a fair competition environment. Compared with 10 to 15 years ago, China now is much more supporting, for example, intellectual property production, much more cautious about subsidies to the SOEs, and much more opening up to its market for companies across the world. So with that, I think it's very encouraging to see those regions to have this carbon neutrality goal. And I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Chen Ji, I think you've touched on some of the most sensitive issues between the EU and China in this, in your excellent summary there, and I'm sure we will come back to them. Nis, we've heard various kind of accounts of leadership and what it looks like now. I think we all understand why it's important, but it is a more complicated landscape. Where do you see it happening at this moment in the run-up to COP26? What do you think is the most important aspect of leadership, and where do you recognize it?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Isabel. First of all, to invite me to this really great panel of experts. I'm going to learn a lot from this, I think. And maybe to add my view here, and I'm looking a little bit more, I'm concerned a little bit more, I have to say, about the general political embeddedness and the political shift that I see, which is, there's a lot of buoyancy for the green agenda, for the Green Deal in Europe and the carbon neutrality pledge. It has, in my mind, led to a lot of buoyancy, but I also see this as a perhaps you could call it a strategic window of opportunity that we really have to use right now, because this buoyancy, I am afraid, and I hope I'm wrong, is not going to last, especially on what Chen Ji talked about on the tech and biz level. Because what I can see when I look at, for example, the 5-year plan proposal that came out, is that some of the frictions that we see that are taking or that are filling more and more on competition, on who's leading on technology, who's setting the standards of the future, and that will be the producer of the producers of technology will set the standards. And China has taken increasingly bold steps here, and is increasingly, it will be leading in certain technologies. So this is on the competition side, which is a very tricky issue, as you all know, between the European Union and China. I don't think we are in for a more easy environment. So I think the window of opportunity here is really to use the buoyancy that the green agenda, the climate pledges give to this issue right now to facilitate, to institutionalize the most ambitious common targets and a common roadmap between China and the EU, and also use the American approach, whatever that will be once Biden takes over. But I'm a little bit concerned about the increasing tensions with the European Union facing a strong China, a China that will not change on values, but will take more and more leadership over in areas of technology and business. And I hope I'm wrong, but I think we have to use this opportunity, and it's great that we have these conversations here, because they are adding. And there's no shortage of conferences and exchange right now, and it really needs to be facilitated better, and it needs to be institutionalized better. The engagement between the European Union and China to smoothen out what I see as coming issues in terms of technology standards, use cases, and all these issues. But I think most of the important points have been touched upon by the others. So I think we'll stop here.
Yes, thank you. And again, you highlight, this very critical area of the overall relationship, the strategic framework, how this is going to perhaps throw up obstacles, or perhaps we can carve out climate as a functioning pathway within this. And I think this is worth a little more attention here, because as I said in the introduction, the diplomatic exchanges this year between the EU and China were very tense, and there is a range of issues which are not going to disappear as European concerns. So questions of Hong Kong, of Xinjiang, we know them, the questions of fair competition, market access, all of those things. Now, any of those could be used as an argument against cooperation with China. So I guess my question is it better to make an entirely sort of separate disposition for climate somehow, and shield it from the other geostrategic tensions? Or will there be a temptation to use climate somehow as a bargaining chip in these relationships? Jennifer, what you observe this very closely. Which would be the better approach, and what are the risks of each?
I'm afraid my answer will be deeply unsatisfying, which is I don't think either kind of clear-cut approach is possible. That's not the reality of the EU-China relationship, simply even just because the EU is not homogenous on this issue. So I don't think that we can ring-fence climate anymore in the way that we have in the past, because it is now an economic issue, and it does verge into things including connectivity and digitalization and innovation and IP and all of the sticky issues that are going to be affected by a lot of this, but also the political space for European leaders to cooperate with China on anything is very much determined by the public perception of China's actions on things including human rights and including kind of rule of law. So I think that it's going to have to remain a dynamic relationship. It can certainly become a bit of a golden thread for cooperation when that political space exists. but it is going to be impacted by these geostrategic issues. It's too real now to be ring-fenced off, and that is going to be the reality of a dynamic relationship. The really key thing on the European side here is to have a bit of a benchmarking approach, a bit of a common approach to when can we cooperate with China, and if so, what do we want to cooperate with China on? What are not just the things that we don't want to do, what are the things that we do want to do, so that when those moments come, they can be seized. But I think this is going to continue to remain a pretty complex and dynamic relationship. So it will require capacity and it will require political attention fairly frequently.
Dongye, Chen Ji, can I ask you to respond to that? Do you think there is an appreciation in Beijing of the narrowness of the field available to European politicians, as Jennifer has described it? You know, their actions are constrained by public opinion, and public opinion on China is at a pretty low ebb right now. This may change, but this year has not been a good year according to the surveys. The US hasn't fared very well either, but this is a constraint on political freedom of action. Do you think this is appreciated in Beijing, and what do you think the Chinese leadership could do to widen that field for European action, to widen the possibilities? Chen Ji, do you want to have a go? Putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult question to answer, because I always believe, as people in the climate community, we always hope that we can have this kind of political kind of environment that benefits the global climate. And I think we are having that. So we are having it right now because of the combination of the factors that we have. But I think it will be extremely difficult to for China to to do more, and then to use that to lever other kind of actionable areas on the EU and China agenda.
Dongye, what do you see as the best option for China to encourage European politicians to push forward with climate despite other complications?
I would have to say it is indeed a very difficult question. What I would say is that we have seen, like for instance, in the transcripts of the calls between President Biden and leaders in the West, that climate has been elevated to one of probably the top 3 geopolitical aspects and questions. And so as much as the geopolitical questions will have an influence on climate cooperation and will have an influence on whether we are able to appear together, have joint declarations, and discuss and enhance each other's climate targets together. I also believe that climate will have an impact on geopolitics, and that climate change, as Jennifer just mentioned very well, will be, if I may steal your expression, a golden thread of the geopolitical relationship between the countries. And I know I'm not really answering your question, but and there's also the fundamental aspect that climate will be inevitable and unstoppable, and so therefore even by themselves the countries will be moving forward with economic measures and concrete measures for climate action. We mentioned just earlier electric vehicles, the development of renewables, new financial standards, just to take into account the real concrete climate risks, and the development of a low carbon industry. And I believe that in turn, those real economic sectors developing growth and developing jobs will be an engine for cooperation between the major economic regions. So I think that in turn, yeah, we'll be able to bring cooperation based on those economic fundamentals.
So you at the beginning, you gave us a very good summary of what we're actually seeing in terms of implementation in China. We are looking at, or will be looking at, very closely the 14th five-year plan, which has been discussed in the plenum and will emerge in March in its outline at the Liangye in March. So that is obviously a kind of component of what China will bring to the table in terms of an NDC. So looking at this question of Ursula von der Leyen's kind of question of what will be in the 14th five-year plan, and looking at the wider question, both in Europe and in China, of backloading of long-term pledges, and to what degree we need to understand that from here till 2030, a lot of credibility of the longer term targets hangs on what happens between here and 2030. So Chen Ji, again, with your wide experience of having modeled, what do you think are the essential elements for the 14th five-year plan that would both move China's ambition forward and give credibility on an international level to its intentions?
I think the central piece during the 14th five-year plan is to stop the new coal capacity for the power sector. That's extremely essential for China moving towards the zero carbon neutrality goal, and even towards the 2030 peaking target. Because once you install those capacities, will take at least 40 years to retire those coal fleet, and it will be a strong locking effect there. Other things like we have to also need to consider kind of plant the seed for fully decarbonizing technologies for what we call the harder to abate sector, right? Those, for example, green hydrogen in steel, in chemical industry, those technologies, the development of those technologies and scale up of those technologies really takes time. So I think we should start at the beginning of 14th five-year plan to test those, to deploy those technologies.
I'm sure you're not a betting man, but if you were, what would you bet on there being no coal in the next plan?
Well, I think no new coal. Yes, I think a lot of voice and a lot of kind of efforts has been underway to help China, to convince China to stop new construction, the construction of new coal. I think we are getting there. I'm quite confident about that.
Nis, you have studied the kind of nuts and bolts of the Chinese state over questions of energy, of what makes these decisions. It's quite surprising, I think, to many observers of China's general direction that new coal should even be under discussion at this point. From what you've heard, are you confident that the 14th plan is going to be robust enough?
Well, looking at China in terms of environmental performance and investment, it is always looking at a very mixed picture. There's a lot of good stuff happening, and there's a lot of bad stuff happening, I have to say. And I think the next five-year plan will kind of be, it will not be the ambitious, break away from the current growth pattern kind of plan, but it will be the off-ramp that sends the signals to everyone, look, this is the direction we are going at, please divest from coal, but it will not, I don't see very tough measures and cuts in for example, the capacity levels of coal. I really don't see that at the current moment. And that is mainly because it is very security focused at this time. I mean, China is in a very tough spot when it comes to its international environment, and that is really stressed in the plan. It is focusing on the domestic side of the economy, and it is getting ready for some sort of soft decoupling. The dual circulation strategy is a part of it, and I think Jude Blanchette at CSS, he put it very good. It's not a decoupling strategy, but it's a strategy for decoupling. I think right now the focus is really on stability and going forward while setting the signals towards a greener type of development. So I don't see the current or the 14th five-year plan as the one being the most ambitious climate roadmap. At the same time, I think there still is, as I said in the beginning, a strategic window of opportunity to push. And right now, is actually it's still time for submitting your input to the plan to the National Energy Administration. I'm sure some of you are doing that to press for maybe a tougher or press for policies that could lead to an earlier peak carbon. By 2025, for example, that I think it's totally possible and feasible. But what I really see as a problem right now is the political environment where China is facing a much more complicated external environment. There's a couple of really, the Huawei debacle is really a lesson for China on how bad it can end when you have a new technology and you want to sell it outside and nobody wants to have it suddenly, and all these things I think are adding to this certainty of in the leadership that we have to double down on our domestic technology development, our domestic economy. So I'm cautiously optimistic in the medium and long term, but for the 14th five-year plan, I'm not sure that we will see radical change.
So that's again a reminder of the importance of the wider geostrategic framework, and you mentioned security and energy security, and I'm sure we all recognise that the stakes have been raised on that front, and that this obviously has domestic policy implications. Jennifer, given that China has heightened security concerns because of what's happened in the last 4 years, because, well, lots of reasons we don't need to rehearse, what could the European Union do in the way of reassurance to maintain a kind of positive forward motion on cooperation? Is there something the EU can do to mitigate the effects of the negative effects of China's security anxieties? And if I may also ask you to respond to the concerns that have come up about future technologies. Now, we know that China is highly ambitious in terms of all kinds of future technologies and has invested heavily in the technologies of the future. You mentioned the question of being a technology maker or technology taker. We have China Standards 2035 now to add to the complications. So just draw me an optimistic roadmap of how the EU could contribute to the positive conversation with China on these issues.
I can try. I think at the end of the day, it takes two to tango. So there are overtures that Europe can make, but the overtures that it can make depends on China's projection at that point in time into the world, particularly on issues around security concerns. So I think the EU has made it clear that it wants to engage with China no matter what. And a big part of that is the simple fact that European climate safety really depends on Chinese decisions. And so that is why climate is really central to this conversation. There aren't just security concerns on the Chinese side. There are very valid security concerns on the European side as well. So I think that is the balance of the security concerns. I think there has been an openness to engage in honest dialogue about this, and I think that's going to be the main thing. I don't think that there is that silver bullet on security concerns that I can pitch to you right now. I think it's about the tone of the conversations between officials changing and shifting. And actually, I've seen some of that happening in the wake of the announcement from President Xi at the UN General Assembly. So I think that is already a very good opening stance. I think the big question around the technology is to differentiate the cooperation that you can do on standards and on regulation versus the cooperation that you can do on the technologies itself. I think cooperation on actual technology innovation is going to continue to be very difficult. Europe continues to be very, very scarred, to be entirely honest, by the experiences around the solar revolution. And so there are sensitivities around technology cooperation, but there is a recognition that in standard setting and in regulatory innovation, that is something where there is a strong alignment, or the strong possibility of alignment, including around things like methane leakage, including around things like green hydrogen, including around things like sustainable finance. And I think that's really where the overtures are going to need to be, because that is really where setting these standards for two of the world's largest markets can have such a significant impact on the rest of the world, that as long as there is alignment that doesn't undermine the quality and the credibility of the standards that Europeans want to set, that is where I think a lot of cooperation can happen. And that can also help address some of the concerns around supply chain security, supply chain resilience, at least some of the security concerns.
Thank you. So a cautious tango beginning. I hope it's not a solo. I'm sure it's not. We have questions. Joanna Klabish asks about the not green investments of various Chinese actors in other regions. In Southeast Asia, we all know about coal power on the Belt and Road. And again, this has been a factor in EU-China discussions on climate. Do we see this changing? Do we hear talk, but do we see action on this, Dr. Chen? On greening China's overseas investments?
Yeah, I think this is really, every time we talk about green investment, this topic comes up. I think it is indeed a very important area that needs a lot of debate. Purely from the Chinese perspective, when they do the kind of overseas investment, particularly for example, the coal-fired power plant. And one argument is that in terms of the kind of resource accessibility, and those countries, if you don't bring very high efficient coal-fired power plant, those countries will build up like small and efficient one. So from that perspective, at least from the Chinese perspective, those investments can be considered as not totally green, but at least greener than the business as usual. I'm not saying that this is my perspective, but I think this is the perspective, from many investors and SOEs and even some Chinese researchers' perspective. But I think in general, it is, eventually, it may take time, but I think we definitely want to shorten that kind of interim period, so that all the investment will be totally green. But it is a very tough kind of call, and I have to say, for Chinese investors and SOEs, given the surplus capacity issue, right? The kind of the issues in the SOEs in themselves, the issues of mobilize the fundings, capitals, etc. I think it related a lot of issues that other than the energy topic.
Nis, is that something that you think the EU can usefully put pressure on? Would that help?
I think, yeah, I think it is possible and it would help. The question though is, are we willing to do so in a unified voice and really putting both political and economic pressure behind it? I mean, to me, you know, from cruising altitude perspective, it is really the next issue, right? Is there just transition mechanism for the world? Do we need to develop some kind of redistribution mechanisms so that energy investments, sustainable energy investments, become the economically rational choice when you, I don't know, when countries need power, and I don't think there's any good answer to this yet on the table. But I think it would be useful to sit at a table more on global investments and standards. And I feel that the Belt and Road Initiative is receiving a lot of flack for not being as green as it wants to be. And I think this is being heard by China. And it's not only the European Union who's putting pressure on China there, but I think it would help, yes.
I like, we have a question about non-CO2 greenhouse gases. I'm sorry, I've just slightly lost it now, but yeah, here we go. And we're talking a great deal, and including today, on CO2, but there are, of course, many other pollutants that that contribute to climate change: black carbon, methane, ozone, refrigerants, and so on. We don't talk so much about those. Is there collaborative action there? Is there credible action on either side on these issues? And how important would you say they were in the discussion? Dong-Yue, is this something that you look at?
I think there's definitely a cooperation that can be had on non-CO2 greenhouse gases. Well, there's not one non-CO2 gases, as the name says, and it covers a lot of sectors. And so some of it, I believe, are more domestic action, like probably on waste or agriculture. It's more of the things that can be done domestically. But for instance, for the F gases, the HFC refrigerants, the Kigali Amendment, if it was ratified by more countries, including in China, could really be a game changer for HFCs. And I believe it can contribute to like a significant reduction of the global warming. As China and also India as well are major producers of cooling appliances that they export over the world. So if standards can be done either in China or also in the more on the demand markets, this is something that could really change the picture for those gases.
Chen Ji, do you see an opportunity in this area of non-CO2 greenhouse gases, and are we taking full advantage of it in collaboration, pushing it forward?
I don't. First of all, I don't think we are taking advantage now at the moment, because most of the focus now is on the CO2 carbon emission and even non-CO2 greenhouse gases. But I think this what we call short-lived climate pollutants is a very is the area that we should also focus on. And as Dong-Yue mentioned, this is actually has a huge core benefit together with dealing with the air pollutant measures. So I think we will get the co-benefit by working on these kind of pollutants.
I see there's a question from a name I recognize, Sam Gill, my colleague, who asks, with Biden elected president, can the EU play a mediating role between China and the United States on climate change? Jennifer, very much your territory.
It is. I think that is definitely part of the role that the EU could play. So particularly on areas where it wants to cooperate with both the US and China on this. I think for a lot of European actors right now, they still want to see how hawkish versus dovish a Biden administration actually turns out to be, and what that means for what can happen in public versus what just needs to happen in much more multilateral fora, what can actually be done in mediation between China and Europe versus what needs to be driven through the G7 or the G20 or similar kind of safer, less relationship specific fora. So I think that is definitely Europe's vision. At the end of the day, a lot of what we're hearing out of President von der Leyen is that we want a common approach to the US and a common approach to Europe, to China. And while Europe is most likely going to sit slightly closer to the US, simply because values-wise, we sit a lot closer to the US, the approach to China and the freedom to choose what to cooperate on China with is going to be really key to Europeans. We've already seen a lot of pushback on attempts by the current Trump administration to curtail Greek and Portuguese engagement with China. And I think any attempts by a Biden administration would be met very similarly. So yes, I think a bit of a mediation role, or at least a mutual engagement role, is certainly what we foresee Europe to be playing for at least the first couple of years.
And what, as if you were to lay a bet on the chances of achieving a completely united position on both of those, what do you reckon the chances are? I mean, we talk a lot about difficulties in China of delivery and fragmented policy arenas, but we have that in Europe, surely.
We definitely do. And I actually think this goes back to a question that Professor Zhao also raises in the Q&A, which is around Brexit. But it's not just Brexit that is dividing Europe right now. And if anything, I think Brexit is kind of slightly separate entity. For me, the bigger question is what happens with the German elections next year when we lose Angela Merkel as one of the big spokeswomen and kind of uniting factors on China in the European space, because we know that is going to be her last year as Chancellor. And very similarly, France will then be facing an election in 2022. So really, for me, the question of whether we achieve this common position or not is how successfully it's driven from Brussels. To what extent both President von der Leyen, but also Charles Michel are willing to invest their own capital in making this common approach work, in the absence of an assertive Chancellor Merkel to push things forward. And that's something that I do think there are still some question marks behind, but I actually think that a Biden presidency will accelerate the timelines on this. So I think we should know by the middle of next year whether this is feasible or not, but the next 6 months are really critical.
It's just going to be such an interesting and important year. The time has flown by, and we're coming to the end of our session, but I would like just to as a closing thought, to ask each of you what you would most like to see that would advance the EU-China climate collaboration for COP26. What's the thing you would most like to see in the next few months? Dr. Chen, may I start with you?
Yes, that's exactly what I want to answer to the David Tyfield question, which is the technology collaboration. I think this is a key area that EU and China should work together on, given the urgency of climate change.
Thank you. Nis, what do you most want to see? What would really put a smile on your face in the next few months?
I really want to second Chen Ji's comment here. And you know, considering the noise that, for example, the China 2025 Made in China 2025 plan made internationally, the tension that led to, I think we will see more of that. I think that we will see more doubling down on domestic technology in the next 5-year plan and the medium and long-term technological development plan that will come out this year. A lot of problems ahead. So I think it is really key now that we leverage the high-level cooperation and the buoyancy of climate action right now to protect what we have in terms of energy cooperation and technological cooperation and science and research. Also, I think it is really under siege at the moment for good reasons, but it needs to be protected. And really, we would really need to double down on the cooperation and the alignment on this issue much more.
Dongyue, your wish, your one wish.
I think everybody also already wished for cooperation. So I wish for China to have a more ambitious 14th five-year plan, because I think a lot of experts and ourselves believe that for China to achieve its 2060 carbon neutrality target, it needs to take climate action earlier and for it to be cheaper. And I believe that this can start with economic benefits, and in provinces where there's social questions that can be addressed with climate action. And hopefully this can also lead to more cooperation. Thanks.
Jennifer, your fairy godmother, you have just a few seconds. What's your wish?
I'm cheeky and I'm going to give you 3, but very quickly. 1, an effective
There are
coal
always 3 wishes.
moratorium from China. 2, collaboration on debt, bringing in Chinese private creditors. That is really key for COP26 success next year. And movement on sustainable finance standards. I think those are really key for all of the other standards that we've been talking about.
Panel, you have been completely fantastic. We could go on for a very long time, but sadly our time is up. To remind participants that our report will, a link to our report will be mailed out to you. And please tune in. My colleague Sam Gill is hosting a session on the US-China relationship at 2 o'clock as part of our London Climate Action Week programme. For now, a huge thank you to London Climate Action Week, to our wonderful panel, and to all of you for watching. Thank you very much.